Let's say it's a lovely Tuesday evening, and you're out there living your best life, building a new commander deck from the comfort of your couch. You start by finding cards. Maybe they're from EDH Rec, maybe they're from Scryfall searches, and maybe they're from your friend Brad, who happens to be an expert on 4 toughness creatures. Regardless, you're finding lots of cool stuff for your deck, and you're tossing them into some sort of deck building website, watching them neatly segregate themselves by card type before your very eyes. This is fine at first, but over time things will start to get a bit muddier. You know the numbers of the card types, which will be helpful for some decks, but additional information is hard to come by. What if you need to know how much low-cost ramp you have to decide on how many higher mana cards you can support? What if you need to know how many cards allow you to cast things from outside your hand, for the purposes of Flaming Tyrannosaurus? What if you're trying to make sure that you've got the right number of things to slow down opponents, and protect what you've got? This is where categorizing starts to become really useful. You can lump a specific group of cards into their own little bucket and keep track of them that way. Though a lovely tool on the surface, categories can range a bit in their usefulness. They can be a helpful tool in deck building, but they can just as easily add more confusion than they elucidate, or even lead players down unfortunate deck building paths, all on their own. So, in this video, I want to talk about what categories accomplish, and how to get the most utility out of them in deck building, as well as how some people are setting back their own decks by using them wrong. Before bumming you out with that though, I want to tell you about something exciting. It's this video's sponsor, Voidmonster. Voidmonster.org is a site created by MTG artist Forrest Imel, who you may know from the original Dockside, rest in peace, and it features some really punchy evocative designs for trading card game accessories. There's the awesome cycle of mana symbol playmats, and there's also an exclusive new drop once a month that's available for a week-long pre-order period, but gone after that. This month is the Greedy Drop, a Pot of Greed shirt and playmat with an added gold-foiled treasure token if you get both, and you can pre-order that until July 6th. You can check that out at the link in the description, and thanks to Voidmonster for sponsoring the video. Okay, so the first thing categories do is capture the core tasks that the cards in your deck are performing, and allow you to specifically look at these subsets. I always start out with categories of card that most decks will want at least some of, principally lands, ramp, draw, protection, and interaction. These categories are useful because all on their own they start to paint a picture of the shape of what a deck is doing. If a deck runs a lot of lands and ramp, I know I'm going to be looking at a big mana midrange deck that's looking to outscale its opponents. If I see a deck that's lower on cards intended to interact with opposing plays and higher on protection, I know I'm going to be looking at something that's faster and more proactive. I'm going to get more into constructing these categories and when to break them up, but first I want to lay out a cautionary note. I've seen a lot of guides recommending people include categories such as theme as a discrete entity alongside these other sorts of function categories, at least in the early stages of deck building, and I simply cannot recommend that as a general practice. This is a somewhat misleading piece of advice because in most successful decks, a large number of these theme cards will also be accomplishing the other core tasks I mentioned earlier: mana acceleration, value generation, protection, and ways to slow opponents. There may be some cards that only do their theme, such as 1-mana birds in a Sephara deck or Merfolk Lords in a Hackball deck, but a whole lot of other theme cards will often be contributing to one of these core categories. If somebody asked me for healthy starting ranges for their core categories for a bog standard EDH deck, I'd say something like 35 to 40 lands, 15 to 20 pieces of removal equivalent, 13 to 18 pieces of draw, 7 to 12 pieces of ramp, and 3 to 8 pieces of protection. What you may notice about that is that if you go on the higher end of each of these values to be safe, that adds up to 98 deck slots. You got a whole one left over to work with after these core categories. This is not to say that you necessarily need these numbers in every deck, or that there won't be overlap between categories, but the implication here is that cards that don't fit into one of these categories are inherently charging your deck an opportunity cost, and you should keep that in mind when deciding how many of them to have. With that out of the way for now, let's get into the meat of these core categories, because there can be nuances in what a category should cover. Lands are the simplest because the deck building role, lands, generally matches up 1-to-1 with the card type of land. You can make an exception for non-mana producing lands such as Glacial Chasm, or specific centerpiece lands like Maze's End, since these won't be producing mana as their primary function, but for most other cards, I keep them categorized as a land first and foremost, with any other functions entered as subcategories I can look at later. In this case, the utility of including or excluding lands from your lands category comes from in how you use that category. As long as the cards in your lands category are cards that you personally consider a land drop, you can do some math on the resulting number and figure out how successful you'll be at making it up to your higher costed spells. Speaking of which, let's talk about ramp. This is one of the trickier core categories because it can vary so much. Most decks want some of it, some decks want a lot of it, a handful of decks won't want much at all. So when constructing your ramp category, you should be asking yourself, why am I ramping? If your ramp is geared to hit specific cards a turn early, you'll want to be specific with the curve of your mana, and it even might be worth including ritual-style cards that can give temporary mana in some circumstances. By contrast, if your ramp is generally geared toward increasing the volume of your mana without specific timing goals, less card-efficient options like smaller ramp and ritual-style cards won't make as much sense, and bigger options will likely work out. You'll sometimes catch me saying something like, Worn Power Stone isn't a ramp spell if you're playing a Krenko deck, because it's fun to speak in quippy absolutes. But what I really mean when I say that is that if your acceleration category is mainly intended to get you to 4 mana a turn early, Worn Power Stone doesn't fit that function, and thus probably isn't worth playing unless you can find another purpose for it. The same goes for interaction, which I choose to define here as cards that exist to set opponents back in some way. The card Murder performs one game action, destroying a creature, but this game action can accomplish a number of different tasks: killing a big attacker, clearing out a blocker, stopping a combo, taking care of a value engine, eliminating a stacks piece, and so on. This fact gets a bit more puzzling when we consider that there are lots of cards that perform some of these tasks, often better than a Murder can, but can't perform others. Fogs are great defensively, and even against some combos, but they're useless for slowing opponents down. Counterspells will be good at protection and combo breaking, but the timing will restrict their usefulness in limiting opposing value, and they can't deal with things already in play. Your instinct might be to back away from this fact and pretend it doesn't exist, but for purposes of categorization, all this means is that in lieu of perfectionism, we can focus on building categories that are flexible and work with our deck's needs. One categorical starting point I've used before is having two slightly fuzzy buckets: protection plus counterspells and removal plus defense. This might sound odd at first, but it makes some sense if you think about all interaction in terms of how proactive versus reactive it is. Protection is very proactive in the sense that it purely supports your own game plan and involves thinking ahead toward possible issues, and counterspells are similar but with a bit more flexibility to hit opposing threats. Removal of all types will be a bit more reactive since it gets played after a problem card has resolved, though since it can target value engines, it could still play more of a calculated long-term role in a deck. Defensive cards like attack and damage prevention are the most reactive in my mind, since they're a thing whose only purpose is preventing a player from losing, the final line of defense in an EDH game. With these different types of cards laid out, the two buckets approach basically just draws an arbitrary line somewhere in the middle of this spectrum of tools, though it might be useful to get more specific. If you have a deck that cares about a particular interactive tool like defense or stacks to hinder things that might otherwise give you problems, give it a category. If you have a deck that cares about protection, definitely give it a category. It'll be good to keep an eye on. Putting this extra thought into categories will also give you a better idea of what your deck does or doesn't need. I'll often include Graveyard Exile in a removal, stacks, or general interaction category because most decks won't gain anything by granting this necessary tool its own category. This won't be the case for all decks, though. My Malfegor deck has 3 separate categories for its interaction suite because they all serve different roles. Discard effects put my opponents behind in value, removal deals with active threats on the board, and Graveyard Exile serves an unusually key role here in preventing opponents with graveyard-oriented decks from getting use out of the cards I'm causing them to discard. On the other hand, if different interaction pieces aren't serving clearly defined roles that you want to keep an eye on, it might be perfectly fine to throw them together in the same category. It all depends on how much you care about distinguishing somewhat different effects from one another. The same is true for draw to a lesser extent. If you have a bunch of normal card draw in your deck, you might call that category draw. If you add in some handful of draw-adjacent things like Lelia or Future Sight, those are also probably fine in the draw category as long as you're not a Quasar player, though you could also rename the category to Value or something. The name isn't too relevant. What is relevant is when different draw-adjacent cards start to perform different tasks. In my draw video, I laid out that various things that allow a player to see and play with more cards can be placed along a continuum based on how much of a player's library they allow you to see. In the middle is ordinary draw, seeing as many cards as it acquires, and on the edges are pure filtering spells which generate no card advantage, and pure value cards which don't even interact with the player's library. In some cases, all of these can be lumped into the same category, tutors, card draw, recursion, and so on, but other times different cards might start to take on different roles. You might run tutors or filtering spells to allow you to find the tools to build up some sort of central engine for your deck. And in that case, you might want to keep the digging cards and the value cards in different categories to keep an eye on how many of each you got. And that's just a case where categories might be nice. Depending on how you're building value, it might be essential to lay out more clear roles. Some decks might run a bunch of draw, discard, looting cards as their card selection to find what they need, and also some recursion or other graveyard synergies as their sources of value to get advantage over their opponents. In that case, those two things are going to be playing quite distinct roles in the deck, to the point where they basically become a whole separate thing, a synergy package. This is the second major thing categories do, allowing people to keep track of synergies. Specifically, for each synergy package, I'll typically include two categories, setup and payoff. As an example, in a flicker deck I include a core cards category that includes my 3 flicker engines, plus a card that increases the overall velocity of the deck. And I also include a category called Tasty Slide, that features creatures with ETBs I might want to repeat through flickering. Relevantly, the former category is a primary category, because pushing my Flicker game plan is the only thing these cards accomplish, whereas the other category is a subcategory that I don't need to see all the time. This is because being flickerable isn't the primary role of these cards, it's simply an attribute about them. The fact that they have an ETB that's useful to repeat is only a relevant fact when I have an Astral Sight effect available, and their role is typically the same in either case, just amplified if they're being flickered. There might be other situations where both setup and payoff are in their own subcategories, or where these things are layered into different categories, whatever ends up making the most sense to you. Regardless, the utility that the categories are creating for you in this case is allowing you to keep an eye on how well supported a specific theme is. It's easy to throw a Flicker Thassa into your deck after spotting a couple cool ETBs, or toss in a Faldorn to go along with some cool Impulse Draw effects. In some cases, these payoff cards might have enough support from other cards to feel valuable, but in other cases, they might not. If you don't maintain a setup category for this synergy in your deck, you might not even clock that this is a problem, and might presume that these cards not working out in games is due to bad luck. If you'd had that setup category, and noticed that you're only running 5 pieces of Impulse Draw, suddenly you'd probably be a lot more vigilant of how these cards are doing in games, and more willing to reevaluate them. I will say that synergy-based usages of categories have become a bit less necessary as deck builders have picked up a particular feature, the search function. If you're on Archidect, you can throw a Scryfall search in this box here, and it'll only show you the cards in your deck that fit this search, which is useful for keeping track of something like my cycling cards in my Shroom deck. Moxfield has something similar. There's this little highlighter thing that you can throw some inputs into, and it'll highlight all the cards that fit that definition. Either of these might suit your preferences based on what sorts of UI you like, but something I like about Archidect specifically is how this works with the maybe board of the deck. Sometimes if I'm building a deck and I'm not sure what direction I want to take it in, I won't stop at categorizing what's in the deck. I'll categorize my maybe board as well. Oftentimes this category will simply be the reason a card isn't in the deck. A lot of times I'll have a too expensive category if I'm building a budget deck, or a too slow category if a card is a bit below the power level I think I'm shooting for. This allows me to have a suite of cards available to peruse if I later decide to power up or power down the deck, and it also acts as a form of documentation of my thought process that I can go back to. The other type of maybe board category I'll include is packages that I'm thinking of adding to the deck, but don't know if there's enough support for yet, such as ETBs or Shamans. This is where the search comes in handy. If I notice I'm ending up with a lot of top of library manipulation, I can plug a search term like shuffle or library into the box, and I'll immediately see how many cards in the different categories and maybe board packages include that term. As a final note here, searches won't always perfectly capture the stuff that might be included in a category. If I searched Enter into my Shroom Slide Flicker deck, among the things that pop up would be Vidalcan Aethermage and Eagles of the North, 2 cards whose ETB is decidedly not the reason they're in the deck. Still, search filtering is a useful tool, and I definitely encourage checking it out if the deck builder you use has it. So, I've laid out the main 2 purposes for categories in my book. Grouping your core categories to keep an eye on the shape of your deck, and keeping track of your synergy packages to have an idea of how thoroughly supported different elements are. Some people have a tendency to treat categories as a means to appease some abstract cardboard god, but truly, whatever works best for you in conceptualizing your deck is the right way to go. That said, before I get too kumbaya with things, it's probably a good idea to reiterate some best practices for the average EDH player. I laid out some examples of what you could do or what you should do, but what shouldn't you do? For one, putting cards together in the same category that are similar on some superficial level, but very different in function. I don't have an issue with combining somewhat different effects so long as they perform roughly the same function. So, for example, Expedition Map and Dark Ritual are very different effects, but they share the functionality of helping a mono black player build up some higher costed plays, and that's a valid category. An example of what wouldn't work is putting Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, and Ghostly Prison together in a stacks category. These cards both impose taxes, but the game actions they tax are basically polar opposites. Thalia is good for slowing more technical decks and giving the upper hand to a creature-based game plan, whereas Ghostly Prison makes attacking more costly but does absolutely nothing to slow down anything outside combat. The former is proactive, while the latter is purely reactive, and merging them into a single category is a recipe for confusion. The other thing to avoid is over-categorizing, basically creating a category to track a type of card that isn't actually useful to track. I'll sometimes track life gain in my grindier decks, and even though this category often contains only a couple cards, it still feels worthwhile because drawing a piece of life gain in something like my Malfegor deck typically feels like a dramatic shift in the dynamic of the deck. On the other hand, I would never create a category like this for an aggressive deck with a strong proactive plan. Sinu is a solid life gain engine in my Yoshimaru deck, but the life gain isn't why I added the card, and drawing into a source of life gain doesn't really impact the decision making of something that is, first and foremost, a beatdown deck. The same goes for another card in that Yoshi deck, 6. I'd call this a recursion spell generally, but it's not in the deck because I need recursion, it's in the deck because it's a solid source of value that's also legendary. In a different deck with stronger graveyard themes, I might have gone with a more specific category, but in this deck, I've opted to stick it with the deck's card draw, where it feels right at home. Now, these are instances where categorizing a card differently could add unneeded complexity to a deck's categories, to over-explain what the cards in the deck do. This is kind of a problem on its own, but the bigger issue with over-categorization is when categories are used to justify the presence of cards that really might not belong in a deck. Let's say I'm building my Yoshimaru deck, and I give Sinu a lovely little life gain category. Maybe a bit unnecessary, but fine, whatever. Now let's say I see a Soul Warden hanging around in a binder, and decide to give it a spin in the deck. And hey, we can toss that in the life gain category as well. Soul Warden is a powerful card that can gain a lot of life, but it doesn't do much in a legendary creature's beatdown deck because life gain isn't a priority there. Without the life gain category, I'd be forced to look at the card and go, wait, why is this here? What is this accomplishing? With this category, I've constructed a justification for this card out of thin air, and might choose to keep this unnecessary card in my deck as a result. This illustrates a side benefit of categorizing a deck. Putting cards into categories requires a deck builder to think about why a card is there, and any cards that didn't end up in many categories immediately become suspect and deserving of additional scrutiny. This is one of the reasons I'm wary of plan or theme categories. They give an easy place to toss cards that might otherwise seem out of place or underjustified. The problem here is the harmful mental shortcutting this category enables, although it actually doesn't have to. I was watching another creator's recent video on categories, and in that video, Commander Baumi is a bit more sympathetic to a plan category in general, but mentions a specific type of card to keep an eye on: plan-only cards, or cards that fit into a deck's central plan or theme, but don't accomplish a whole lot else. I found this perspective interesting, so I actually ended up recording a long chat with Baumi where we compared and contrasted our views on categories a bit, and I think it's interesting to consider how deck building style informs what categorization practices end up working out the best. You can check out that full conversation over on my newly created second channel, Salubrious, although I've also included a portion of that conversation starting now.
They know me as the guy that knows a lot about Magic and has a bunch of cards, right?
Yeah.
So they're like, I pulled this valuable card. Do you want it? And I'm like, sure, maybe, depends. Like, what do you want from it? Well, I would like to trade for it. And I'm like, okay, what cards are you looking for? Well, I would like some upgrades for my Tevil deck. And I'm like, okay, you're gonna need to be a bit more specific. What are you looking for? And that's where they are already stumped. They don't know, right? Because they don't actually know what they are even looking for. They would struggle to use a system like you were describing.
Sure. Yeah, and I get that. I fairly oftenly play against players who are at least somewhat new, who've maybe been playing Commander for 2 months, 6 months, somewhere in there, occasionally like new players, but usually more often it's going to be the people who are kind of into the format. For those people, I almost want to say ignore some of what I'm saying, but I think where this sort of kind of more intricate categorization approach is helpful is just for identifying areas of concern. So if you are, if you are taking the time to look at, say, let's go back to like the cast from Exile payoffs and Exile You May Play cards, those two kind of interlocking payoff and setup. If you're playing with those, I think it's useful to categorize those just so you can have a sense of how large those numbers are. If both of those numbers are like 12 or like 10, then you are going to be able to feel decent. But if you have maybe like...
This is exactly what I think is very helpful. And this is something that I think so far you have left out. And I asked for it earlier. Mm-hmm. You've just given me numbers, right? If I tell a player, if you want to do a synergy package for impulse drawing, you gotta need 12 cards. They can work with that. But if you just say, well, you gotta feel it out, I don't know, that doesn't mean anything.
Yes, I know. People probably... It is more helpful if I can deliver numbers. I don't necessarily think it's appropriate to deliver numbers always.